Welcome to Podcast, the Business of Dentistry podcast, brought to you by Practice Plan. Podcast delivers the best business advice, real-life stories and practical hints and tips to make your practice a more profitable and sustainable business. And now, here's your host.
In this edition, Iain Stevenson, Wesleyan Financial Services Head of Dental, is talking to Steve O'Connor, Associate Director of Christie Co, a specialist business property advisor to dental professionals. They'll be discussing Christie Co's recently published Business Outlook and what it means for dentists and their business and personal finances. As always, this podcast is for information only and doesn't provide either financial or business planning advice. But if you do feel like you need advice, stay tuned until the end, where I'll let you know how to get in touch with us. And with that, I'll hand you over to Steve. And first up, Iain.
So, Steve, there were some really interesting facts and observations made in the Christie Co 2024 Business Outlook. And I would like to just take a look at some of the key points to consider what they mean for the dental profession and for dentists, business and personal finance. So one standout for me was the market sentiment survey, which found that 20% more respondents were positive about the year ahead compared to 2023. Despite workforce issues, higher costs of doing business, while 9% felt negative. Why do you think that is?
It's a great question, Iain. I think 2023, presented a number of challenges. You just mentioned some of them: inflation, cost of living pressures on our personal finances, ongoing recruitment issues across the profession. I think the two big ones there were inflation and interest rates. 2023 started with very fast and very frequent interest rate rises, and I think that spooked the market to some extent. Buyers were reluctant to push forward with their acquisition plans, and they wanted to put things on pause whilst they waited to see how things panned out. And inflation was obviously an ongoing challenge throughout the year. Towards the end of 2023, we started to see interest rates stabilise, and indeed in the start of this year we've started to see them very slowly reduce, and hopefully that's a trend that will continue. Inflation has come down quite significantly from the sort of highs of 11% where it was. So the outlook is pretty positive across the board after, as I say, what was a very challenging 2023. I think we, and indeed practice owners across the profession, go into 2024 with high hopes that 2024 should be a good year for them.
Excellent. Thank you, Steve. So, you mentioned a few of them there. So the dental industry really has encountered a number of hurdles in recent times. You mentioned the cost of inflation, rising interest rates, ongoing workforce issues, particularly within NHS dentistry. However, Christie Co maintains a positive outlook for the dental market. So why do you think that is?
I think as we've mentioned, after a lot of challenges, the overall outlook is still one of positivity. We expect this year, just by the nature of the economic outlook, to be more positive than last year. But I think dentistry in particular, it's a needs-driven sector. People will always need to visit their dentist. People, over the last few years, I think have almost changed their perception of going to the dentist. They're now more willing to pay for private treatments. They're more willing to pay for cosmetic treatments as opposed to just maintaining their basic oral health. And so I think the public is more willing, despite the cost of living pressures, actually, to just spend more money on dentistry. That's something that has obviously been a big boost over the last few years to practices up and down the country. But I think that change in attitude, primarily from the public, is what we'll see the dental sector continue to thrive over the medium and long term.
Yeah, some really good points there that I'm sure a lot of people will understand. It'll be very familiar to them. Moving on to sales market. So where do you see the sales market going in 2024, Steve? So what's the outlook for acquisition of private practice versus NHS practices, for example?
Yeah, good question. So I think, again, referencing 2023 again, after what was a challenging year, with far fewer number of transactions taking place compared to previous years, I think we go into 2024 expecting things to almost settle down, or recalibrate, perhaps is a good word. So once practices have been through that period of stabilisation, I think there'll be a gradual return to appetite, particularly amongst corporate groups, to acquire. They in particular have been pretty slow in their acquisitions over the last 6-9 months. However, that kind of presents other opportunities as well, because what we have seen is, particularly at the larger end of the scale, whilst corporate practices are perhaps not acquiring as aggressively as they have been, that's opened up a unique opportunity for independent dentists to purchase some of the larger sites that usually would have typically gone to the corporate groups. So I think there's more transactions within the independent space rather than the corporate space. With NHS practices, it's fair to say that private practices have been more desirable over recent years than NHS practices. There's always a core of buyers who like the comfort of having an NHS contract and an NHS dental practice, and I don't see that going away at all. I think the big challenge with NHS practices in particular is recruitment, and whether or not they've got dentists in place to be able to deliver on their NHS contract. Typically what we see is, if they have enough dentists to deliver the UDAs that they're required to deliver, the practices are in demand and are saleable. If there's NHS practices that don't have dentists, which we do see from time to time, it's a different story, unfortunately. So I think the main challenge with NHS practice sales in particular is one of staffing.
Yeah, it's an area we're going to come back to later. Really important point, and I picked up on the recalibration and stabilisation of the dental world, and that's something I think, again, it's familiar to the world that we live in as well, in terms of providing financial advice.
Yep.
That's definitely something that applies to us as well. So yeah, really good point, Steve. Thank you. Moving on to practice valuations then. So what do you think the dangers are for practice values in 2024 and even the longer term?
So I think the biggest dangers, I suppose, I don't know that I would phrase it as danger, perhaps. I don't think we see practice values dropping off a cliff or anything like that anytime soon. I think despite the challenges actually of last year, practice values were incredibly resilient. They did roll back very slightly, but in the grand scheme of things, and compared to the highs that they were at in kind of autumn 2022, they rolled back pretty modestly in truth. So I think, as we've mentioned, with NHS practices in particular, recruitment is the biggest danger that can have a major detrimental impact on the practice value if they don't have dentists to deliver their NHS contract. With private practices, I think one of the big things that the market has missed over the last 9 months or so has been a lot of activity from corporate groups. There's a number of corporate groups who've put acquisitions on hold. There's been a few notable mergers between some of the larger players over the last couple of years, and I think that's done is reduced the pool of those corporate buyers, and what's happened as a result, and also driven, I'm sure, in large part to interest rates and inflation and so on. But the terms being offered by corporate groups are now far less favourable than they were 12 months ago. And so I think that's making potential sellers just take a moment to pause and reflect on whether now is the optimum time to exit. But in general, I think we see practice values, being maintained, remaining fairly stable. And I'm sure as and when competition returns to the market in full swing, I think we'll start to see perhaps some small growth in practice values.
Okay, really interesting insight there, Steve. And it sounds like good news in terms of practice valuations. So excellent. So you mentioned interest rates there. I mean, with the anticipation of the Bank of England base rate likely to fall this year again, do you think that the cost of the drop in the cost of borrowing will impact practice prices?
I think it will, but perhaps again only modestly. As we mentioned, despite all the challenges, practice values didn't fall too much throughout 2023. So if we're already kind of starting from a pretty strong baseline of practice values. What I think has happened is buyers are now accustomed to the fact that the cost of borrowing money is more than it has been historically. You know, if you go back only a couple of years, the base rate was 0.1%, I think, and now we're up to 5.25%. So it's been a big shift, but I think that's now costed in with buyers who are seriously looking. They know that it's going to cost more to obviously borrow money and fund a practice purchase. Any reduction in the base rate, which we undoubtedly expect to see over the coming year, will be good news, and it all helps with their affordability and ultimately the financial performance of the practice that they go on to acquire if they've got less interest payments to make. But as I mentioned previously, I think practice values will in large part remain flat initially, and we'll perhaps start to see some very modest growth in the latter part of this year.
I know how difficult it is to try and anticipate which way the market will go and indeed what will happen with the economy. So yeah, really interesting to get your insight on that. So finally, you mentioned workforce issues earlier and some of the things obviously that will impact practice ownership. So we know there's been an ongoing workforce issue with many practices experiencing difficulties in recruiting associate dentists. Do you think this will improve, Steve? And how might that impact in practice values?
Yeah, great question, Ian. I always smile internally when I hear these types of questions because I'm an avid news reader, and listening to politicians who, whenever they talk about UK dentistry, you'd think there was no issue. You know, there's plenty of dentists floating around, and they can't see what the problem is. I think speaking with the number of practice owners that we do, you know, week in, week out, it's you know, widely known that there's a serious recruitment issue up and down the country for UK dentistry. I think historically it's always been difficult to find good dentists, but it's no longer restricted just to dentists. It's the same now for hygienists, therapists, experienced qualified nurses, and so on. So it's kind of all staff within practice as opposed to simply the clinicians. I think anecdotally what we probably hear is lots of dentists wanting to get out of the rut of NHS dentistry and move over to private practice. So that's obviously putting an even greater challenge on NHS dentistry. I know that the government have introduced a few different initiatives recently, but they will all take time to filter through and bed into the industry. So that I know that they're making it easier for overseas dentists to come and work in the UK, which is great news. But again, they've still got to go through you know, rigorous tests and so on, which often takes a couple of years or more. They've also increased the number of dental spaces available at UK dental schools, which again is great news, but that's going to take years before those first tranche of additional people start to qualify. And so there's no quick fixes. At the moment, it is a real challenge. We're seeing as well, again anecdotally, I think, but there's so many dentists now reducing their days and working part-time as opposed to full-time. And so whilst the number of registered dentists with the GDC, I think is at one of its highest levels ever, the actual days being worked in dentistry is not at its highest point. It's lower than it has been historically. But that's because people are choosing to work, 3 and 4 days a week instead of 5 days a week. So there are real challenges. I think it will improve, but I think it will take time before any visible improvement is seen. It's painful and a real challenge for practices at the moment, particularly those who are recruiting. I think what we have seen is a real push by practice owners to try and make their practice a nice place to work. Once they have recruited new staff members, be it a dentist or a dental nurse, I think there's much greater emphasis now on retaining those members of staff, which can only be a good sign and a good thing for the profession. But yeah, so to answer your question, Ian, I think there will be improvements, but it will take time for them to filter through.
Yeah, really tremendous insight there, and it's exactly what we are seeing when you think about the workforce plan that was introduced last year. It was designed to try and address some of this stuff, but that was exactly my observations of that. It's like, yes, it's great we're encouraging more overseas dentists, but it will take time. It's great we're going to be looking to bring in or create more spaces for therapists and hygienists, but that'll take time. In the meantime, more and more people are going part-time. So I think it's a really relevant point to talk about the kind of full-time equivalent versus actually the number of dentists registered. So yeah, great insight.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Okay, I think a bit of a whistle-stop tour. I know that your report is lengthy and extremely detailed and extremely informative. And if anybody wants to look at it, I'm sure they could find that, Steve, on your website, because it's a fantastic piece of work and really good insight to the world of dentistry, and it gives people an indication as to where they're going. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you for tremendous insight and sharing your knowledge with us today. And hopefully we'll speak soon.
Yeah, thank you ever so much, Ian. Thanks for having me, and all the best. Look forward to hopefully doing another podcast with you soon.
Thank you, Steve.
And that's our show for this week. Thank you to Ian and Steve. If you are looking for expert financial advice for you or your practice, go to wesleyan.co.uk, where you can book a no obligation appointment with one of our specialist financial advisors. To learn more about Wesleyan more generally, you can find us on Twitter/X and Facebook, Instagram, and of course LinkedIn. And if you found the podcast useful, you can like and subscribe to us on all the usual platforms, as well as on YouTube, where there's a whole library of videos covering a wide range of financial planning topics.